You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. Introduction. In early 1919, Seattle, Washington, witnessed a massive labor action in which approximately 65,000 workers ceased work for 5 days, from February 6th to February 11th. This strike was in solidarity with shipyard workers from various unions who were denied the right to work due to their pursuit of increased pay. The strike saw a broad range of local unions, including those affiliated with the American Federation of Labor and Industrial Workers of the World, participate in the cessation of work despite disapproval from the national AFL leadership. Authorities, media, and many citizens perceived the strike as a radical challenge to American society and values. The workers' calls for wage increases came shortly after World War I, a conflict during which wage restrictions had been justified but were no longer pertinent. Seattle's union ranks had swelled significantly between 1915 and 1918, partly influenced by the revolutionary spirit sparked by events like the Russian Revolution. Amidst a climate of fear and suspicion towards leftist ideologies, which would soon escalate into the Red Scare of 1919-1920, this strike was cited by some as an outcome of Bolshevik and radical infiltration, reflecting a burgeoning unease with what was considered un-American political beliefs. Background. During the early 20th century, particularly between 1915 and 1918, the number of unionized workers in the city skyrocketed, with an increase in union membership by a whopping 400%. The labor force in the United States, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, was notably influenced by radical thought, with a significant number of rank-and-file workers being inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and aspiring to a similar upheaval in America. In late 1919, longshoremen in Seattle made a stand by refusing to load weapons meant for the forces opposing the Bolsheviks in Russia, exhibiting aggression towards those who tried to do so. The unexpected arrival of a Russian vessel, the Shilka, into Seattle on December 24, 1917, fueled speculations of Bolshevik links to the labor movement there. Damaged by a storm, the ship sailed into Seattle port, barely surviving on dwindling supplies. An informant led the local U.S. attorney to believe the ship intended to support what was considered as the enemy, referring to labor groups contemplating a strike. The community was rife with rumors suggesting that the Shilka's presence indicated a connection to Bolshevik support for local labor unrest. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer exacerbated these suspicions with a false front-page story alleging the ship carried substantial funds for freeing jailed members of the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW. However, a thorough search of the ship dispelled these rumors, finding no significant evidence, although a sailor claimed any potentially incriminating materials, like flyers, may have been discreetly removed upon docking. Another individual from the ship was detained for engaging with local unions. Although hard evidence of the Shilka's links to Seattle's labor combatives was never uncovered, the sentiments of the era supported at least a philosophical alignment with Bolshevik Russia, further motivated by the Bolsheviks' intent for a Western revolution that could provide Russia with support. The Shilka remained in Seattle for about a month before departing, not to return to the area. In Seattle, most labor unions were formally connected to the American Federation of Labor, AFL. However, the actual viewpoints of the workforce often leaned more towards radical ideologies than those of their union leaders. A labor leader acknowledged in mid-1919 that the majority of workers were united in the belief that they should be the ones in charge of industry operations, even though there was no consensus on the means to achieve such control, with opinions varying from cooperatives and political to industrial actions. The dissemination of revolutionary ideas was evident throughout Seattle. Pamphlets discussing the Russian Revolution were commonly seen being read by commuters, including workers from shipyards, symptomatic of the intense discourse among the labor force regarding their objectives and methodologies for obtaining influence and authority. This eagerness for change manifested in the workers' discussions about assuming workers' power as an imminent practical goal. Seattle's business community observed these developments with disapproval, aware of the serious implications for the existing order. Strike. Several weeks after the cessation of World War I in November 1918, labor unions within the shipbuilding sector in Seattle asked for higher wages for their unskilled workers. They founded the Seattle Metal Trades Council, consisting of representatives from 21 different labor unions. Initially, there were only 17 unions participating in the initial strike vote. By the time of the general strike, these various unions had unified and negotiated collectively through the council, which regularly crafted overarching agreements for all its member crafts. In August 1917, they had managed to standardize pay for a third of the metal workers in Seattle. James Taylor served as the president of the council when the general strike occurred. When the shipyard owners attempted to weaken the union's solidarity by proposing a pay raise solely for skilled workers, the union refused this offer. Consequently, about 35,000 shipyard employees in Seattle halted work on January 21, 1919. A conflict ensued when Charles Pease, the leader of the Emergency Fleet Corporation, EFC, a government-established entity during the war and the primary employer in that industry, warned the yard owners through a telegram not to agree to any pay raises, threatening the cancellation of contracts. Ironically, this message that was intended for the Metal Trades Association, the group representing the owners, was mistakenly delivered to the Metal Trades Council, the union. This blunder led to an uproar among the shipyard workers, who felt betrayed by their employers and the federal government, with the latter seemingly aligning with business interests through the EFC. In response, the workers sought the support of the Seattle Central Labor Council for an all-encompassing strike involving all workers in the city. A wide array of unions participated in the vote, displaying overwhelming approval of the action, including those typically seen as conservative. Altogether, about 110 local unions backed the initiation of a general strike set to start on February 6, 1919, at 10 a.m. Those joining the strike included military veterans who demonstrated their solidarity by wearing their military attire on the picket lines. Life during the strike. During the strike, the workers who were participating formed a unified group known as the General Strike Committee. This committee functioned similarly to a temporary government for the city, taking charge of essential community services. Despite the strike, they made sure critical tasks such as garbage collection, hospital laundry, and firefighting continued to prevent health hazards and danger to the public. The committee decided which labor activities could continue and marked approved vehicles to indicate their sanctioned status. If continuing work was necessary to safeguard lives, it was not stopped. Independently, workers also took matters into their own hands to serve the community. For example, when milk wagon drivers were not allowed to keep certain dairies open by their bosses, they responded by setting up 35 local milk distribution centers. They also established a food service, which served up to 30,000 meals daily throughout the strike. Meals were offered at a low cost, with strikers paying less than the general public, and featured an all-you-can-eat option, including dishes like beef stew and spaghetti. To keep the peace, military veterans formed the Labor War Veterans Guard, a non-violent alternative to the police. This group, which didn't carry weapons, relied solely on peaceful persuasion. Their presence contributed to the largely peaceful atmosphere in the city. Arrests by regular police were unusually low, and there were no arrests associated with the strike. The overall tranquility of the city during this time was remarkable to observers. The way the striking workers organized themselves showed similarities to anarcho-syndicalism, possibly indicating the influence of the industrial workers of the world in the region. This is despite the fact that only a handful of the striking groups were officially connected to the IWW. Radical visions. Propaganda material advocating revolutionary ideas was scattered throughout the city. A notable pamphlet titled "Russia Did It" delivered a powerful message, urging people to follow the example set by the Russians. It challenged individuals to confront their destined struggle under the oppressive employers, suggesting that without taking action, they would be subjected to a lifetime of hard labor for meager wages. It pressed the working class to overthrow their employers and take control of their workplaces, thereby gaining command over their lives instead of surrendering their labor for the profit of their bosses. In the Seattle Union Record, a publication aligned with labor interests, Anna Louise Strong, who was sympathetic to the Soviet cause despite not being a union member herself, wrote an editorial on the possibilities presented by a general strike. She pointed out that simply halting work in Seattle would not greatly concern the wealthy elites from the East. However, a shutdown of capitalist-run businesses coupled with workers stepping in to run essential services would signal a major shift towards workers' power. This scenario, where workers not only cease operations, but also take them up under their own governance, preserving public services and peace, could lead to a transformation with unpredictable consequences. Her editorial, which evoked both intrigue and concern, was circulated by newspapers nationwide, indicating the significance of her perspective on the potential impact of the strike. End of the general strike. The cessation of the strike was influenced by three concurrent developments. Mayor Ole Hansen bolstered law enforcement and troops, suggesting their use to maintain order and potentially to replace workers on strike, even though there was no unrest. Union leaders, particularly those with more authority and at the upper echelons of the labor hierarchy, grew concerned that the tactic of a general strike could backfire, hindering their organizational endeavors. Observing the formidable opposition they faced and heeding the apprehensions of their leaders, union members began to return to their jobs. The General Strike Committee ultimately pointed to the influence of international union leaders and the challenges of persisting in a city brought to a halt as reasons why the strike ended. On February 7th, Mayor Hansen prepared for confrontation by deploying 950 sailors and Marines throughout the city and expanding the police force by 600, in addition to enlisting 2,400 temporary deputies, mostly from the student body of the University of Washington. He threatened to replace the workforce with 1,500 police and 1,500 troops the following day, although this turned out to be a hollow threat. Continuing his verbal offensive, on February 9th, Hansen compared the strike to the Bolshevik Revolution in Petrograd and made it clear he was prepared to use lethal force against anyone trying to assume control of the city's government. In the interim, national labor leaders and the American Federation of Labor, AFL, began pressuring the General Strike Committee and individual unions to end the strike. Yielding to the pressure, some unions resumed work. The strike committee's leadership, under the same external pressure, proposed to terminate the strike on the night of February 8th, yet their motion was initially rejected by the broader committee. However, some signs of the city coming back to life emerged on February 8th, including streetcar services and the main department store reopening, followed by the Teamsters and newsboys resuming work. Finally, on February 10th, the General Strike Committee voted to end the general strike by February 11th, which was effectively concluded by midday. The committee cited pressures from high-ranking union officials, as well as from the practical difficulties workers faced living in a city in lockdown as reasons for the decision. While the city had been immobilized for 5 days, the general strike ultimately fell apart as labor reconsidered its strategy amidst significant pressure and its inability to counteract Mayor Hansen's messaging. Despite the end of the general strike, the shipyard strike, which prompted the general strike to begin, continued on. Aftermath. After the conclusion of the widespread strike, authorities detained 39 members of the Industrial Workers of the World, accusing them of being instigators of disorder, even though they had only a minor influence on the progression of the strike. In the aftermath, Seattle's mayor at the time, Ole Hansen, claimed responsibility for bringing the strike to an end, a stance that earned him the acclaim of certain media outlets. However, he resigned from his mayoral duties not long afterward and embarked on a speaking tour across the nation, where he warned about the perils of radical leftist ideologies, which he termed domestic Bolshevism. During this lecture circuit, he managed to make $38,000 in the course of just 7 months, which was significantly more than his yearly earnings as the mayor. Hansen maintained that the peaceful nature of the general strike did not diminish its subversive objectives. He professed that the strike's lack of violence did not conceal its true revolutionary intentions, which sought to dismantle the established industrial order first locally, then globally. He argued that revolutions do not necessitate violence and considered the general strike a potent tool of revolution, especially because of its non-violent approach. According to Hansen, the overarching aim of a general strike is to disrupt all societal functions, effectively incapacitating government operations, which he equated with a revolt. During the period leading up to the strike's commencement on February 4th, the United States Senate decided to extend the scope of the Overman Judiciary Subcommittee's investigative activities. Initially established to probe German espionage, the subcommittee's mandate broadened to include inquiries into Bolshevik propaganda. The subcommittee initiated a series of hearings on February 11th, coinciding with the downfall of the general strike. In its explosive report, the subcommittee painted a grim picture of Bolshevik misdeeds and pointed to the presence of domestic revolutionaries intent on stirring a revolution and eliminating private property. In this context, the labor unrest demonstrated by the Seattle general strike was conveniently aligned with the subcommittee's perception of a threat to American societal structures.